or when you're really nervous and anxious, like, oh, I just have to get this done, like, oh, you're not in control. You're just trying to work against the tide, trying to make sure it doesn't happen, but you're believing that it will happen. And so I know that I'm not the only one that's dealt with that. And I'm like, well, what do I have to lean on? The whole world is saying you need a father and a mother, but I'm in this situation and there is not a father in this picture. And I don't believe for 1 minute that God's going to forsake one of his children, but I didn't know what truth to look at. I didn't know. I couldn't figure it out. And I'm like, I would cry so much and just be so upset that, I wanted to be a good mother. I wanted to provide this life for him that was just amazing, but I felt like it was impossible. I felt like because of everything the world is telling me, and honestly, a lot of the preaching I would hear, because it is important for the church to uphold the good standards, and because we need to be reminded of the how to live as Christians, but then never hearing about how I could this was possible, that there's possibility in all things. So with all that said, what do we do with that? If someone were to come up to you when you were pastoring a church and they would tell you that story, what would you tell them?
Well, as you were mentioning, your experience with your children, son or children?
Son.
With your son, that reminded me of David. And I recall that so many of the Psalms, it seems that David is in a situation where he's fearful. And he has good reason to be fearful. His enemies could be chasing him. He could be worrying about wild animals. We could be worried about all sorts of things that are attacking us in life. And it comes to me that in the early part of those Psalms, David is very fearful. He's worried about his circumstances.
Right.
And as David begins to turn his eyes to the Lord, that fear begins to dissipate and dissolve. So maybe our fear is most powerful in our lives when we take our eyes off the Lord and instead look at the circumstances around us. That's when it can become terrifying. Yeah. If instead we look through the fog and spend time concentrating on He who eliminates all fear, then we can rest. Not because we know how the situation is going to work itself out, not because we have the answers, but because we know that we're in good hands, and it's not an insurance company. God knows exactly what's going on. He knows exactly where He's taking us, and if we can trust Him there, if we can believe His promises, then the fear, we don't even have to concentrate on eliminating the fear, it just kind of dissolves as we instead put our eyes on Him.
Okay, so like you said that the Lord created emotions, and so in a way we can look at fear or any other emotion for that matter as a red flag or a warning sign that maybe our eyes aren't focused on the Lord. We may think that we are, or that or any other given circumstance, but since we're talking about fear, if we're experiencing fear and it's terrifying and paralyzing us, then maybe we need to take an assessment. I mean, where are my eyes fixed?
You bet. I think virtually all of the emotions can be used either by the Lord or by the enemy. And we go back and forth, don't we?
Yeah.
So it's probably appropriate when we're really sensing fear, let's evaluate it. We may not be able to do that on our own. We may need to invite some wise friends or folks into our lives to help us evaluate that particular situation. But I think the enemy can use that fear, and that's when we're going to get discouraged and fearful and paralyzed.
Right.
But if instead we sense that fear is coming from the Lord because He wants our attention and He wants us to pay attention, then positive things come out of that. So let's be really careful and see who we're listening to most when it comes to our experiencing that fear.
Right. I am listening to. I think that brings us exactly to our next element of this whole discussion. And when we think about this fear that I experienced, and I know other single parents have experienced, of what's going to happen with my kids, is I identified two basic lies that we're listening to. One being, I have no influence in my child's life, that I can't impact them for some reason, that I can try and try and try, but ultimately, because of the circumstances, my influence won't matter. The second lie that I identified was that I'm a victim and I basically have to give my child up to the world. So we have and really both are under the same umbrella of kind of a victim mentality, is that this has happened to me, I'm helpless to change anything, I can't influence, and therefore, what am I going to do?